8 days, $500,000. An international team of specialists armed with diagnostic equipment worth more than most people earn in a lifetime, and Eleanor Chase's Bugatti Chiron Supersport still sat motionless, cold as a museum exhibit that had forgotten it was once a machine built to move. No sound, no signal, no explanation that held together past sundown. Then Isaac Ward walked in, a man in a faded canvas jacket, calloused hands, driving a pickup truck that looked like it had no business pulling into a $3.9 million dealership. He knelt beside the car, stayed quiet for 3 minutes, then made one move, and the Bugatti roared. What happened in those 5 minutes? The answer will change the way you think about expertise forever. Cherry Creek Boulevard on a Monday morning looked the way money always looks when it is trying not to be obvious about itself. Wide glass facades, polished stone sidewalks, and the particular kind of quiet that only exists in places where things are very expensive. Chase Prestige Motors sat at the corner where the boulevard curved, 12 showrooms spread across 4 states, and the Denver flagship was the crown of all of them. Inside, the floors were Italian marble, the lighting was calibrated to make every curve of every vehicle look like it had been sculpted rather than manufactured, and the staff moved in the careful, unhurried way of people who understood that the clients they served did not appreciate being rushed. On a normal Monday, it was the kind of place that made visitors feel they had stepped into a different category of existence. That Monday was not normal. Eleanor Chase stood at the far end of the main corridor, one hand resting at her side, the other pressed flat against the interior glass wall that separated the showroom from the service garage behind it. Through the glass, visible beneath a protective cover that had not been removed in 8 days, sat her Bugatti Chiron Supersport Midnight Blue, custom-ordered, delivered 8 months earlier after a wait that had stretched across most of a year. She had driven it for 7 of those 8 months with the kind of satisfaction that only comes from owning something exactly the way you imagined it. Then, one morning, she had walked to the garage, put her hand on the door, and found nothing. No response. No sound. The car simply refused to exist as anything other than an object. Eleanor Chase had built Chase Prestige Motors from a single inherited branch office into a 12-location operation with a combined annual turnover that placed her in a bracket of people who no longer discussed money in the same terms as everyone else. She had done it by making decisions faster than her competitors, by reading situations with a clarity that bordered on instinct, and by never, not once in 17 years, allowing a problem to simply wait her out. She was not a woman who stood still in front of glass walls. And yet, there she was, fingers pressed against the pane, watching a covered car that had not moved in 8 days. The men responsible for solving that problem were somewhere behind her, assembling their materials for another morning briefing. Hunter Blake had arrived from Auto Elite International with a team of 4 specialists and a contract worth $500,000. Auto Elite was not a local operation. It was the firm that serviced hypercars for collectors in Abu Dhabi, maintained race-prepared vehicles for clients in Monaco, and had once flown a technician to a private island in the South Pacific to address a single brake calibration issue on a one-of-one commission. Hunter Blake himself had more certifications framed on his office wall than most mechanics had tools in their shop. He was, by every conventional measure, exactly the kind of person you called when the problem was too large for anyone else. The Chiron Supersport had been delivered with a full manufacturer's documentation package and a service history that was, as of 7 months in, completely clean. No unusual readings, no warning flags, no behavior outside normal parameters. Then, on an ordinary Thursday morning with the temperature in Denver sitting at 31 degrees Fahrenheit, the car had simply refused to start. Not a gradual failure, not a warning light the day before. The engine management system reported no faults. The battery read normal. Every individual system, when interrogated separately, answered correctly. The car was, by every measurement the diagnostics could perform, perfectly fine. It simply would not run. The 8 days that followed were a lesson in what happens when certainty meets a problem it cannot categorize. Hunter Blake had walked into Chase Prestige on day 1 with the particular confidence of a man who has solved harder problems in worse conditions, and that confidence had not yet left him, but it had changed texture. It was harder now, more defended, the kind of confidence that stops being a product of success and starts being a product of pride. On the first 2 days, the Auto Elite team deployed an Otis E diagnostic system and a specialized CAN bus reader that together represented more computing power than a small engineering department. The result was precise and baffling. No faults recorded anywhere in the system. Every electronic control unit, the engine management, the transmission controller, the battery management system, responded correctly to every query. The car's internal architecture believed it was healthy. The diagnostics agreed, and still the engine would not fire. This was the first signal that whatever was wrong existed below the level that standard diagnostic architecture was designed to reach. Days 3 and 4 brought replacements. The 12-volt auxiliary battery and its management system were swapped out in their entirety, at a parts cost that would have covered a year's salary for most mechanics working in conventional shops. Every relay in the primary power distribution box was pulled, tested, and either cleared or replaced. Nothing changed. Hunter then turned his attention to the firmware layer, the low-level software that governed how the car's systems communicated with one another, and placed an urgent call to a contact at Bugatti's headquarters in Molsheim, France. A firmware update package arrived by courier the following morning. The labor cost of applying it and the consultation fee together came to $47,000. The firmware changed nothing. On day 5, a senior technical advisor from Molsheim joined a 4-hour video consultation from his office in Alsace. He was methodical and careful, and he concluded that the problem might lie in the low-level electrical architecture, and that resolving it would require removing the entire wiring harness for manual inspection. Hunter declined to pursue that path, calculating correctly that the risk of compounding the damage outweighed the likelihood that the harness was the culprit. The consultation cost $38,000 and left the car exactly where it had been. Days 7 and 8 brought the central control unit replacement and a complete manual inspection of every fuse and connector accessible from the engine bay. On day 7, Logan Pierce, the youngest member of the Auto Elite team, a man who had spent 4 years working on Formula 2 support vehicles before Hunter recruited him, had raised his hand in the morning briefing and suggested a secondary ground check. He had phrased it carefully, as junior members of teams led by senior specialists learned to phrase suggestions that contradict established procedure. Hunter had given the proposal 10 seconds of consideration and dismissed it. The primary ground points had been checked on day 1. Ground failures were elementary. This was a Bugatti Chiron Supersport, not a vehicle where elementary failures went undetected for 8 days. What Hunter did not know, what no one in the room knew except the car itself, was that Logan was pointing at the right location and the wrong justification. He was close. He was not close enough. On the morning of day 9, Hunter Blake stood in the Chase Prestige conference room in front of a whiteboard covered in system diagrams and color-coded fault trees and delivered a briefing that was technically impressive and practically empty. The next step, he explained, was a full removal of the primary junction board, a process that would take between 5 and 7 additional days and incur an additional $120,000. Eleanor Chase listened to the entire presentation without moving. When Hunter finished, she stood up from her chair, closed the folder in front of her, and said 4 words, "I'll give you 24 hours." Then she walked out. Logan Pierce did not follow the rest of the team back to the garage immediately. He stood at the window and watched the parking area below. A dark blue Ford pickup had turned in through the service entrance, a vehicle with the kind of wear on it that suggested it had been working for a long time and had no plans to stop. On the passenger door, in small block letters that had been repainted at least once, were the words, "Ward Automotive General Repair." The pickup did not belong at Chase Prestige Motors. That was obvious to anyone who looked at it, and several people did. The parking attendant who waved it toward the service bay out of habit rather than recognition, the receptionist who looked up from her desk when she heard the unfamiliar engine note, and the junior technician who saw it pull in and assumed it was a delivery gone wrong. It was, in fact, exactly that. Eleanor's logistics coordinator had been searching for an emergency parts transport service the previous afternoon and had dialed Ward Automotive by mistake. The listing sat 3 lines. Had taken the call, confirmed the address, loaded the parts into the back of his truck, and driven out the following morning without attaching any particular significance to the errand. Isaac Ward was 43 years old, and he looked it in the way that men who have worked with their hands for a long time tend to look their age not diminished by it, but marked by it. His hair was dark with gray at the temples. His jacket was canvas and had been washed enough times to lose its original shade, and the way he moved suggested a man who had spent a great deal of time in spaces where economy of motion mattered more than appearance. He carried the parts box under one arm and held the delivery paperwork in his free hand. And when he pushed through the service entrance of Chase Prestige, he took in the space around him with the flat, comprehensive attention of someone whose eyes had been trained to read environments rather than simply observe them. He was walking toward the service desk when he passed the mouth of the main garage bay and saw, through the opening, the tail end of a covered vehicle. A section of the protective sheet had shifted, exposing the rear quarter panel and the exhaust assembly. Isaac Ward slowed his pace. He did not stop. He did not change direction. He looked at the visible section of the car for approximately 2 seconds, then continued walking. But something in his bearing had altered in those 2 seconds, a very slight stillness, the kind that comes not from hesitation, but from recognition. He found a junior technician at the parts desk, set the box down, and began going through the handover process when Hunter Blake appeared at the far end of the bay. Hunter had come back to the garage after the conference room cleared and was standing near the main diagnostic station, reviewing the previous day's printouts. When he saw Isaac, a man he did not recognize, carrying a box, wearing clothes that did not belong in this particular facility, he addressed the nearest staff member without lowering his voice, who let this person into the technical area. "I've asked for restricted access during the consultation period. It was not hostility. It was something more efficient than hostility, the administrative dismissal of a variable that did not fit the current framework." Isaac did not react to this. He finished reviewing the delivery paperwork, waited while the technician located a signature, and then turned to leave. He passed the entrance to the main bay a second time, and this time he stopped. Not for long, 3 or 4 seconds. He was looking at the covered car. More specifically, he was looking at the section of the exhaust assembly that the shifted cover had exposed, and he was reading something in it that was invisible to everyone else in the room. He asked the technician standing nearest to him a single, quiet question. "What's wrong with it?" The technician gave him the short version: wouldn't start. 8 days. Specialists from out of state. No resolution yet. Isaac nodded. He thought for a moment. Then he asked, "What month was it delivered?" The technician didn't know. Isaac nodded again, as though the question had been answered anyway, and walked toward the exit. He was 5 steps from the door when Eleanor Chase came through it, moving at her usual pace, the pace of a person who had already decided where she was going before she started walking. She saw Isaac, assessed him in the space of a breath, and looked at her coordinator. After a brief explanation of the mistake, she looked at Isaac with the polite, impersonal efficiency of someone closing an open variable. "Thank you for coming. Someone will see you out." Isaac had half turned toward the exit when Hunter Blake arrived at the entrance to the bay, drawn by the shift in the room's attention. He looked at Isaac with the particular expression of a man who has spent years being the most qualified person in any given room and has begun to mistake that pattern for a law of nature. He was waiting for Isaac to leave first. Isaac did not leave. He looked at the covered Bugatti, then back at Hunter Blake, and said with the tone of a man making an observation rather than a challenge, "Have you checked the secondary ground point behind the BMS module?" Hunter's response was immediate, polished, and comprehensive. He listed the diagnostic systems deployed, the components replaced, the firmware update, the Molsheim consultation, the total hours logged by his team, a recitation delivered with the smooth authority of someone who has delivered it before and expects it to end the conversation. He concluded, ground integrity was verified on day 1. This is a Bugatti Chiron Super Sport. It isn't a question of overlooking something basic. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The implication was structured into every word. Eleanor was watching. She had not moved toward the exit, and that itself was information. Isaac looked at Hunter Blake for a moment, then said, "Which ground point?" Hunter's response came a half-second too late. The standard, primary points. Everything accessible from the main service diagram. Isaac waited another moment, as though giving the answer time to settle, then said, "There's a secondary point that doesn't appear on the standard diagram. It's behind the BMS module, inside an auxiliary compartment that was added for a specific production variant. If this car is the one I think it is, that point exists, and it won't show up on any diagnostic you ran, because the systems don't know it's there to check." Hunter's jaw shifted slightly. That's a significant claim from someone who came in to drop off a parts order. Eleanor did not look at Hunter when she spoke. She looked at Isaac and asked, "From where?" Isaac answered quietly, "I spent 11 years at Molsheim. Final position was lead calibration engineer for electrical architecture. My group handled bespoke production specifications for the Chiron Supersport and Devo variants." A pause that lasted 2 seconds. "I signed the documentation for this car's production configuration the week before I gave notice." The room did not go loud. It went in the other direction. Hunter Blake's expression did not collapse. Men who have stood in front of high-net-worth clients in difficult situations develop a kind of structural rigidity that survives most impacts, but something behind his eyes recalibrated. Logan Pierce, who had been standing near the diagnostic station with the careful stillness of a man who has learned to stay invisible during moments of professional tension, slowly set down the papers he had been holding. Eleanor looked at Hunter. Her voice was level. "Did your team check the secondary ground behind the BMS?" Hunter said yes. The word came out smoothly, with the practiced certainty of a man who has spent 8 days defending a process. He had checked the documented ground points. The form said complete. The form was accurate. What the form could not account for was the existence of a component that was not on the form. Isaac said nothing more. He did not press the point. He looked at Eleanor and offered the quietest possible version of a proposal. "I can take a look. It won't take long." Hunter cut in before Eleanor could respond. "Auto Elite cannot accept liability exposure from an uncertified third party working on a vehicle under our active service contract." If something is damaged, Eleanor stopped him with a look that contained no anger and very little warmth. 8 days, she said. $500,000. She looked at Isaac. "What do you need?" Hunter Blake did not leave the garage. He stayed near the diagnostic station, arms crossed at a precise angle, watching with the expression of a man who has moved into a defensive posture so smoothly that he believes no one has noticed. Logan Pierce positioned himself 3 feet to Hunter's left, close enough to observe and far enough to not appear aligned. Isaac Ward asked for a flashlight, a standard digital multimeter, and access to the vehicle. He did not ask for a diagnostic terminal. He did not ask for the service documentation. He did not ask for anything that cost money or took more than 30 seconds to retrieve. Isaac Ward walked around the Bugatti Chiron Supersport once before he touched it. He moved at the pace of a man covering ground he already knows, not inspecting the car the way a stranger would, looking for evidence, but reading it the way someone does when they are remembering rather than discovering. His right hand came to rest briefly on the car's flank at a point just behind the rear wheel arch, and then again near the base of the windshield pillar. Both touches were light. Both lasted less than 2 seconds, and neither had any mechanical purpose that anyone in the garage could have articulated. Logan Pierce watched both of them. Isaac asked Logan a question, directing it at him rather than Hunter, without appearing to make a deliberate choice. "The 12-volt auxiliary battery, which supplier?" Logan told him. Isaac nodded. Not in satisfaction, but in the way a person does when incoming information confirms a prior calculation. He crouched beside the rear section of the car, shone the flashlight along the lower edge of the body panel, then straightened and moved to the driver's side rear corner. He stood there for a moment, not moving, the flashlight held loosely at his side. Then he said, "I need the auxiliary compartment opened, driver's side, rear of the primary engine bay, recessed panel." Hunter Blake stepped forward. "That location isn't marked on the Chiron standard service documentation." Isaac looked at him with the even, non-confrontational expression of a man who is simply going to continue doing what he is doing. "I know. The compartment was added in a bespoke electrical configuration that applies to a specific order window. This car is from that window." He paused, I know it's there because I designed the specification that put it there. Logan Pierce moved to the rear of the vehicle without looking at Hunter for approval. He found the recessed latch on his second pass and pressed it. A panel clicked open, hinged from the bottom. Inside was a wiring cluster that appeared, at first glance, completely ordinary. The insulation was intact. The connectors showed no corrosion, no heat discoloration, no physical damage of any kind. Hunter looked at it from a distance, and his posture shifted almost imperceptibly, just enough to suggest that he had expected to see something and had not. Isaac took the flashlight and directed its beam at the terminal end of the ground lead where it seated into the connector block. He held it there for 4 seconds. Then he placed the multimeter probes, one on the ground lead, one on the chassis reference point, and looked at the reading. He looked at it for a long time, not because the number required study, but because he wanted to be certain of what he was seeing before he said anything. Then he stood and held the multimeter display toward the room. The resistance figure it showed was not catastrophic. It would not have triggered a fault code, would not have illuminated a warning light, and would not have appeared on any automated diagnostic report as a problem. But it was elevated above the threshold that the Chiron start-enable circuit required. Not by much, by enough. Logan Pierce looked at the reading and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, almost to himself, "Temperature dependent." Isaac looked at him. The conductor has a micro-crimp at the insertion point, a partial compression of the core wire that doesn't break contact, but increases resistance. In cold ambient conditions, Denver mornings in this season run between 28 and 33 degrees Fahrenheit. The metal contraction is enough to push the resistance above the start-enable threshold. By midday, when the garage warms up, the expansion brings it back down. He paused. That's why every diagnostic your team ran came back clean. You were running them indoors, at operating temperature. The fault only exists at cold soak. Hunter Blake said nothing. There was nothing in his professional vocabulary designed for this particular moment, a moment where the problem had been identified, the mechanism explained, and the explanation was correct. Logan looked at the meter reading, then at Isaac, then at the floor in front of him. The junior technicians at the back of the garage had stopped pretending to work on other things. Isaac set the multimeter on top of the closed panel, straightened his jacket, and said, "I'll need a 16-gauge jumper wire and a pair of ring terminals. I have them in the truck." He said it the way a person says a thing that is going to happen, as distinct from a thing that requires permission. He came back from the truck 2 minutes later, carrying a small red toolbox that looked as though it had been in service since before some of the Auto Elite team had started school. Inside, a coil of 16-gauge wire, a crimp tool, a small sheet of fine grit abrasive paper, a pair of ring terminals, and the multimeter he had already returned to the case by habit. Hunter Blake had used those 2 minutes to say something to Eleanor in a low voice near the service bay entrance. Eleanor had listened without responding. When Isaac came back through the door, she was standing where she had been standing before. Isaac set the toolbox on the floor beside the open panel and worked in the way that people work when the action is familiar enough to have become physical memory rather than conscious procedure. The first thing he did was cut the end of the compromised ground lead cleanly, removing the section that contained the micro-crimp. He used the abrasive paper to clean the surface of the connector block's terminal point. Not quickly, not slowly, but at exactly the pace required. He measured the new section of wire against the gap, added 3 centimeters for the loop, and cut. He seated the first ring terminal in the crimp tool, positioned the wire, and applied pressure 1 clean compression, checked by hand, checked again with a slight pull. He measured the resistance at the new connection. The multimeter returned a reading that was 17 times lower than what it had shown 3 minutes earlier. He connected the jumper wire from the secondary ground point to the nearest chassis anchor, a bridge, temporary, sufficient. The connection took 40 seconds. He closed the crimped terminal with a second check, confirmed the seating of both ends, then straightened up and looked at the open panel for a moment before closing it. The latch engaged with a small, definitive sound. He stood, picked up his tools one at a time, and placed them back in the red box, and closed the lid. Then he looked at Eleanor Chase, nodded once, barely a gesture, and walked to the driver's door of the Bugatti Chiron Supersport. He did not ask for permission. He did not announce what he was about to do. He simply opened the door, sat down in the driver's seat, and settled into it with the ease of a man occupying a space he has occupied before. The interior of the Chiron closed around him, the leather, the carbon fiber, the instruments in their precise arrangements. His left hand rested on his thigh. His right hand moved to the start button. He pressed it. The sound that followed was not what the word roar suggests in common use, something violent or sudden. It was deeper than that, and more controlled. The sound of a 16-cylinder engine, with 4 turbochargers coming to life, in a space designed to contain exactly that much power. It was the sound of the machine doing what it had been built to do, and had been unable to do for 8 days. It filled the garage the way a particular frequency fills a room, finding every corner, registering in the chest rather than just the ears. Isaac Ward let the engine run for 15 seconds, long enough to confirm that the idle was stable, that no secondary faults had been triggered by the restart sequence, that the temperature readings were climbing as they should. Then he turned the engine off, placed his hand on the door frame, and stepped out. He put the key fob on the roof of the vehicle and looked at it for a moment without any readable expression. Logan Pierce had closed his eyes during the first 2 seconds of the engine sound. When he opened them, he looked at the car for a long moment, then looked at Isaac. He did not say anything. There was nothing to say that the sound had not already said. The junior technicians at the back of the bay were not pretending to work anymore, they were simply standing there. Hunter Blake stood near the diagnostic station, arms no longer crossed, hands at his sides, his face arranged in an expression of careful neutrality that required visible effort to maintain. Eleanor Chase had not moved. She was looking at the Bugatti, and for the first time in 8 days, she looked like a person who was not waiting for something. Eleanor Chase did not ask how he had done it. She asked who he was. The distinction was, for anyone who knew her, significant. She was not interested in the method. She was interested in the source. Isaac answered the way he answered most questions briefly, with no material left over. Isaac Ward. I run a shop in Lakewood. Eleanor did not look away. Before that, he kept his eyes on the car. 11 years. In Mulsheim. Final position was lead calibration engineer for electrical architecture. My group handled bespoke production specifications for Chiron, Super Sport, and Devo variants. A pause that lasted 2 seconds. I signed the documentation for this car's production configuration the week before I gave notice. Hunter Blake made a sound that was not quite a word, something between a correction and a reflex, and then stopped himself. He reformulated and said, with the measured tone of a man working to recover the frame of a conversation that had shifted against him. If you were working at Bugatti, why are you operating a general repair shop in the suburbs? It was the right question asked for the wrong reason. Isaac looked at him, not with hostility, not with the satisfaction of a man who has won something, but with the flat attention of someone who is going to answer accurately and briefly. My wife died 5 years ago. I wanted to be somewhere I knew. He did not add anything to this. He did not indicate that it required any particular response. Logan Pierce had his phone in his hand. He had typed 2 words into a search engine, Isaac Ward, Mulsheim, and the first result had come back in under 2 seconds. He turned the screen toward Hunter without saying a word. The result was an article from Automotive Engineering International, dated 4 years prior, discussing advances in low-voltage electrical architecture for limited production hypercars. The byline read, Isaac Ward, lead calibration engineer, Bugatti Automobiles SAS. There was a photograph, a younger version of the man currently standing in the garage, taken in an environment of considerable industrial cleanliness, standing beside what appeared to be a wiring harness prototype. Hunter looked at the screen for 3 seconds, and then looked away. Hunter made one more attempt, the attempt of a man who is not willing to concede the full territory even when the main position has been taken. He said, with technical accuracy, that the bridge wire Isaac had installed was a temporary measure, that the car required proper repair through an authorized service facility, that the correct fix was a full replacement of the compromised wiring section using factory-approved components, and that operating the vehicle in its current state was not formally sanctioned by the manufacturer. Every one of those statements was true. Isaac said, "He's right." Hunter's expression did not change, but the quality of his stillness shifted. Isaac continued. That's a bridge solution. The compromised section needs to be replaced. The factory kit includes the correct gauge wire and a pre-terminated connector matched to the original spec. Bugatti will ship it from Molsheim on a 3 to 5 business day lead. Until it arrives, the car runs safely, but it shouldn't be driven hard. He looked at Eleanor. I'd recommend calling Molsheim directly and referencing the production sequence number. They'll know which kit. Eleanor was looking at him with the expression of someone assembling a picture from components that had previously appeared unrelated. She said, "How did you know this was the right car? You saw 2 seconds of the exhaust through a shifted cover." Isaac answered. The exhaust assembly on the bespoke electrical variant has a modified bracket at the collector junction, a small geometry change to accommodate the routing of the secondary ground harness. Standard Chirons don't have it. I recognized it. I also read the last 4 digits of the production sequence from the stamp on the bracket, and those digits fall within the run I was working on when I left. He paused. It's a small thing to notice if you put it there. The garage was quiet in the specific way that spaces become quiet when the people in them are processing something at a rate faster than conversation allows. Logan Pierce looked at Isaac with the expression of a man who has spent 4 years working for someone who dismissed his best instinct on day 7 and is doing the arithmetic on what that cost. The conference room at the end of the east corridor had not changed in 8 days. The same whiteboard, the same fault tree diagrams that Hunter's team had added to incrementally as the problem resisted resolution, the same view through the window of the courtyard where the delivery vehicles parked. Eleanor sat in the same chair she had occupied during every previous briefing. Hunter Blake stood, which was his instinct in situations where standing gave him a marginal advantage in posture, if not in argument. He made his case carefully, and it was not entirely without merit. His team had operated on the information available to them. Bugatti's documentation for third-party service providers did not include specifications for bespoke configurations, a structural limitation of the manufacturer's information sharing policy, not a failure of Auto Elite's research process. The secondary ground point existed in a compartment not marked on any service diagram accessible through official channels. Given the information they had, the procedure they followed was correct. The firmware replacement, the BMS work, the control unit swap, all of it was legitimate diagnostic response to a problem that presented with no discernible root cause. Eleanor listened to all of it. She was good at listening. It was one of the tools that had built her business. She let him finish and then said, "Did you ask me for the car's full order history before you began?" Hunter said he had requested the standard manufacturer documentation. Eleanor said, "I have the complete bespoke order specification on file in this building. If someone had asked me for it on day 1, it would have taken my coordinator 20 minutes to retrieve it." Hunter said that requesting customer documentation was not standard Auto Elite procedure on initial engagement. Eleanor said, "That tells me something." She continued in the same level tone, without sharpening it. On day 7, one of your team members suggested checking the secondary ground. Hunter started to respond. She finished, "You dismissed it, not because the procedure had already been done correctly, but because you had defined the scope of the problem in a way that made the suggestion seem redundant. You were solving the problem you expected, not the problem that existed." Hunter said that, without the correct documentation, the scope he defined was the reasonable one. Eleanor said, "You were brought in to solve an unreasonable problem. Reasonable scope is not the right tool for that." The conversation continued for another 12 minutes. Hunter made several more attempts to reframe the situation around liability, around information asymmetry, around the technical legitimacy of his team's process, and each of them was accurate enough that Eleanor could not simply dismiss them. But she did not need to dismiss them. She was trying to understand what had happened, and she had understood it before the conversation began. Hunter had entered a situation he did not fully understand, operated according to frameworks that did not apply, dismissed the one instinct from within his own team that pointed toward the answer, and when confronted with a man who knew the answer, deployed his professional credentials as a reason to disregard what that man was saying. All of this had cost Eleanor Chase 8 days and $500,000, and all of it had a rational explanation that Hunter could defend point by point. The rationality of the explanation was, Eleanor had come to understand precisely the problem. She ended the meeting by saying that Auto Elite's contract would be honored in full. The payment would be processed by end of business. She would not be renewing the engagement, and she would not be providing the referrals that had been part of the informal understanding when the contract was signed. She said none of this with visible satisfaction. It was information, delivered professionally, without performance. Hunter Blake picked up his folder and left the room. Logan Pierce was not in the conference room. He had made a choice, around the time the meeting began, about where he wanted to be, and it was not in a room where he would be required to stand behind a position he no longer believed in. He was in the garage, sitting on the metal bench along the far wall. Isaac Ward was still there, leaning against the workbench near the closed auxiliary panel, looking at nothing in particular. Logan sat for a moment, then said, "Why didn't you say who you were when you first came in?" Isaac looked at the floor, then at the car. "If I'd introduced myself, the first question would have been why I'm running a parts delivery service in Lakewood instead of working at Molsheim. I don't have an answer for that question that I'm interested in giving to strangers." Logan thought about this, but if you'd stayed quiet, the car would still be dead. Isaac nodded slowly. "That's why I didn't stay completely quiet." Logan was quiet for a moment. Then, "How long had you known what was wrong?" Isaac didn't answer immediately. He looked at the car at the place where the auxiliary panel sat, closed now, looking exactly like the surrounding bodywork to anyone who didn't know what to look for. "When I saw the bracket on the exhaust, maybe 30 seconds after that." Logan absorbed this. He looked at the Chiron, then back at Isaac. "And you still almost walked out the door." Isaac said, "I was going to leave a note at the front desk on my way out. Didn't seem like my business until it seemed like it was." Eleanor Chase came into the garage from the side corridor. She walked at her normal pace and stopped 10 feet from Isaac, which was a precise distance close enough for conversation, far enough to keep the exchange something other than intimate. She looked at him and said, "What's your rate?" Isaac shook his head, a small motion, without drama. "I was here to deliver parts. The delivery's been signed off." Eleanor said, "That's not what I'm asking about." Isaac looked at her for a moment. "You don't owe me anything for this." Eleanor said, "I know I don't. That's not the question either." Isaac looked at the car. Then he said, "The car's going to need the factory kit when it arrives from Molsheim. Whoever does the install should know exactly where the secondary point terminates and what torque spec applies to the connector block. It's not in the documentation." He paused. "I know the spec." Eleanor held his gaze for a moment. "I'd like you to be here when the kit arrives." Isaac said, "I can do that." Eleanor said, "I'll send the contract to whatever address is on your delivery paperwork." It was not a question. It was Eleanor Chase doing what she did, converting a variable into a settled matter before anyone had time to reopen it. She did not say thank you immediately. The words came only when she was 2 steps from the exit, spoken without turning around, at a volume that was for him and not for the room. 8 days ago, if you had come through the front door instead of the service entrance, I would have asked you to leave within 30 seconds. She stopped, but did not turn. "I want you to know that I know that." Then she went back inside. Isaac Ward stood in the empty bay for a moment. Logan Pierce had already moved toward the exit, giving the space back to whatever silence it wanted to hold. Isaac picked up his red toolbox from the floor, checked the latch, and walked out through the service entrance to where his truck was parked. He put the toolbox behind the seat, started the engine, and pulled out of the Chase Prestige Motors service lot onto the back street that ran behind the boulevard. The morning had warmed in the way Denver mornings do when the sun clears the foothills quickly, without ceremony. He drove with the window down and the radio off. On the seat beside him, the multimeter sat in its canvas case, the leads coiled neatly, the way he always coiled them at the end of a job. The drive back to Lakewood would take 22 minutes. He knew a route that avoided the main roads. Behind him, in a garage on Cherry Creek Boulevard, a Bugatti Chiron Super Sport was ready to run.